All right, it looks like we have a good chunk of folks who are going to be joining us logged in. So I'll go ahead and get us started. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bryce Neff, and I am the Associate Director of College Affinity and Faculty Engagement at Lehigh with the Alumni Relations team. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Mountain Talk with David Gordon. So before we begin, a couple of quick housekeeping notes that I wanted to touch on just about the format of the presentation. If you're new here and haven't joined us for one of these before, so the session will run for about 45 minutes in total, about 15 minutes of presentation time with our speaker, and then about 25 to 30 minutes of Q&A with you, the audience. Now, the engagement and the questions that you guys submit really drive the conversation and allow us to really dig into the insights and the information that we're looking for to learn about David's position at ESPN and all the exciting things that he's going to share with us today. So also, depending on the number of questions, if we get a lot of them, we may not be able to get to all of them by the end of our session time. And then also, the session will be recorded and posted to the Alumni Relations YouTube page for later viewing. So if you have to step out and use the bathroom or grab a bite to eat, or if you wanted to share this presentation with friends afterwards, then you're more than welcome to do so. Now, to get to why we're here today, our speaker, David Gordon, class of 2015. David is a senior researcher with ESPN's Statistics and Information Department. And in his role, he provides ESPN's television, radio, digital, and social media platforms with statistics, context, and historical perspective to drive the company's differentiated content. He uses expert-level knowledge to identify and pitch storylines to show producers, build graphics to illustrate the intended context, and write scripts to anchors to read on air. Now, with that said, it is my pleasure to pass the floor to David. Thank you so much for joining us today and giving the Lehigh community an inside look about the work that you do.
Thanks, Bryce. Appreciate that introduction, and thanks everybody for joining this. I'm definitely really excited to be the latest speaker in the Mountain Talk series. I've enjoyed some of the previous episodes, and there's been some really impressive speaking. So I'll try to hold my own here today. And what I realized was my first PowerPoint presentation since my final business class in 2015. So a little rusty on the PowerPoint end of things, but I'm sure we'll have some fun. And the goal today is to peel back the curtain a little bit into what it's like to work in sports media, what it's like to work at ESPN, and specifically how research and statistics is sort of involved in the overall sports media landscape. And a lot of how I got to this position is thanks to my Lehigh experience, so I'll certainly touch on that as well. And it was definitely a fun challenge to try to bundle everything that I wanted to talk about today into a short presentation. So certainly happy to expand on any of the topics that I touch on in the Q&A portion, or potentially answer any questions on something that I might not have gotten to at all. But just to start, some quick background on myself. Grew up a huge sports fan. I was obsessed with the statistics side of sports. I'm from Connecticut. I was a big Mets and Jets and Knicks fan. Not a lot of winning to go with those teams, but it didn't matter. When I was young, I would wake up, go to the sports section of the newspaper, check the box scores, and just always try to be up to speed on how my favorite players and teams were doing. And so when I went to Lehigh, I knew that I still had this strong passion for sports and statistics. And even though, Lehigh's sports curriculum isn't what the university is necessarily known for, there were still a lot of really good resources that I was able to take advantage of, which included writing for the Brown and White student newspaper, and then also interning in the Lehigh Sports Information Department. Some background on what a sports information department is for anybody who might not be familiar with it. Every university has one for all of their athletics programs. Essentially, the sports information department is sort of in charge of all of the communications to the media surrounding all of their programs and different events. So starting in the fall of my junior year at Lehigh, I was able to get a internship for some class credit that involved myself right into the thick of the sports information department's operations, who could certainly have used my help for, it's a very small operation. It's sometimes 3 to 4 employees responsible for over 20 varsity programs. So when I had this experience, the main takeaway was really that statistics might not necessarily be the story in sports, but they can certainly amplify and enhance a story. And as I was writing preview notes and game recaps for, some of the more mainstream sports like basketball, or some of the less mainstream sports like golf, I quickly realized that statistics were a way to drive a player story or a team story. And at my tenure, we were really fortunate to have a strong basketball program. Overlapped with CJ McCollum for a few years. Obviously, he led the team to an NCAA tournament victory. That was my freshman year. And so that sort of brought a national media scope to the men's basketball program. Usually it was more local media who were following the varsity events and relying on the sports information department's preview notes, game recaps, all that stuff. But it was really here that I sort of learned, okay, media members rely on me, the intern at the time, for some information. And even still today here at ESPN, and myself, when I'm generating research notes, I'll read the preview notes from the sports information department and make sure that the key, the best storylines are sort of in front of me, so that way I can relay it to the rest of the people I work with. So this was definitely a springboard for me. It allowed me to get a couple other internships later in my college career, which eventually brought me here in 2016 at ESPN Stats and Information, like Bryce laid out. And I just wanted to provide some background into what the department looks like. There's essentially 3 groups within the department. Stats and Analysis is our team who processes all of the data on ESPN.com and on the ESPN app. So if you're on either of those platforms and you are looking at scores that night, or team rosters, team statistics, any data on the website or the app comes from that group, processing all of that, inputting it, making sure it's accurate, all that stuff. They do that on a daily and nightly basis. There's the bottom line folks who are editing everything that shows up on what we call the bottom line, or you might refer to it as the bottom ticker if you're watching any of ESPN platforms. So they are processing obviously the scores for all the events that day, and then they're also sort of editing the key storylines and determining what are the most important stories that are needed to best serve the sports fans. And then there's content research, which is the group that I'm in, and we sort of support both of those groups while kind of being our own thing. But for example, at the bottom line, they might add some sort of research context as the scores are processing or as a big story is developing, and they'll rely on us to sort of give them necessary context to help, again, enhance or advance a story. And we're split into day and night staffing. There's probably, give or take, 50 researchers. We also have certain teams for every sport. So if you're more interested in one sport or the other, you'll be a part of that team. So for instance, the NBA team is sort of those who are focused primarily on the NBA and NBA research and driving different stories. for the NBA specifically. And then just to sort of paint a picture, as I know some of this could be, brand new, some examples of where SIG content lives. So where, when I generate a statistic or a colleague of mine generates a stat, where does it go? It really can go on any of ESPN's platforms, and all of them sort of rely on my group to give them accurate and insightful information. So on SportsCenter, it's in the form of full screen graphics and topic bars. Studio shows is referencing NFL Live or the NBA Today. And then all these other examples, for event, maybe it's Monday Night Football and they are, in the middle of a game running a graphic about Jalen Hurts throwing, 20 yards downfield and he's 7 for 8 and there's some sort of context. We're sort of the statistics and information authority. And a lot of people on the day side, if you're working days, are getting requests from digital writers, social editors, radio commentators, and most of the people on the night side are sort of reacting to the live action that's going on and coming up with original ideas during the game windows. So quickly on sort of my path, when I got out of training in 2016, I was assigned a show that didn't have a particularly large number of eyeballs on it. That was the 7 p.m. SportsCenter on ESPN News. But as the weeks became months and months became years, I was able to sort of demonstrate a decent ability to provide interesting statistics, accurate as well. And I ended up sort of stepping into larger roles within the group, moving to shows that were on the main ESPN channel, such as the Morning SportsCenter and Get Up. And then a few years ago, there was a opening for a research position with the Scott Van Pelt SportsCenter show. And I took advantage of that opportunity, and that's been my main assignment for the last few years. And then I also do lead our SIG golf team, which allows me to travel to the broadcasts that ESPN programming has bought the rights to, which is the Masters and the PGA Championship. So for those specific weeks, I'll be in the broadcast booth with our radio and television announcers, helping them with, obviously accurate information and then interesting nuggets about players or the courses or whatever storylines there might be. So when people ask me what do I actually do, like on the Scott Van Pelt show or in any of my assignments, I think Bryce did a really nice job laying it out there. I would say a typical show is comprised of highlights, post-game sound from players or coaches, commentary from the hosts and the analysts, and then research graphics that help either wrap up a performance or advance and spin something forward. And I'll show you some examples of what these are like. But that's my jurisdiction is the graphics part, writing the script for the anchors to read. So obviously accuracy is of the utmost importance for that, because if there's a typo in a script and somebody doesn't catch it and the anchor reads it, it's the anchor who's being yelled at on Twitter. It's not me. So just a couple of examples here to sort of walk you through a typical shift. This was on the conference championship Sunday back in January, and the Eagles just had a blowout win over the 49ers after beating the Giants 38-7 the week before. So in my role, I'm digging into, 8 or 9 different ways to graphically represent the performance. And so for me, I was thinking to myself, okay, this is their second straight win by at least 3 touchdowns, in the divisional and conference championship round. What is the context to that? Like, is that something that happens often? Is it rare? So on. And it ended up being relatively rare. Only 4 other teams had done it. And I chose this because it hadn't happened in 33 years. So those 2 items sort of led me into thinking, okay, this might be the graphic that I want to show after the first highlight. And sort of the icing on the cake was that each of the 4 teams that had done it before the Eagles, they finished off their season with a Super Bowl victory. So that is the way you spin the story forward, is, okay, here's how impressive it is, right? Only 4 other teams have done it, and it hasn't happened this long. And then, by the way, good sign for the Eagles fans, which obviously ended up not happening, but it looks like they have a great shot of winning the Super Bowl because XYZ. So that's a real world example of sort of what I'm doing during a shift. And then I included this one as well because this was a few minutes later in the show. Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs just got back to the Super Bowl. So, after that Eagles graphic, they, did the 6.5-minute Chiefs Bengals highlight, and then some post-game sound from Patrick Mahomes on getting back to the Super Bowl for a 3rd time. And then, the show producer was looking for some sort of research angle to help just wrap up that section of the show. And I had noticed it was Patrick Mahomes' 10th playoff win. And when he's super young, I didn't expect him to be the youngest, but this I thought was a really interesting list to be on. Obviously, any list with Brady's sort of interesting. You have a young Ben Roethlisberger in that photo, and so on and so forth. So I referenced on my Lehigh slide that I sort of realized sometimes the statistic can be the entire story. And that's what I think we're seeing on that bottom line note with Novak Djokovic. He broke Steffi Graf's record earlier this week for the most weeks spent at number 1 in the tennis rankings, which is a huge deal. And the rankings have been around for more than 40 years. So when something like that happens, that's an example of a statistic essentially becoming news. Like, that's something that other news outlets will pick up. And credit to the guys on the tennis team here who found that, got that out, and then the collaboration with the bottom line sort of brought it to life. And then here, you see our social outlets will also use my notes, my colleagues' notes, and as will event. And then I think my favorite, definitely most relevant stat here that I like to circulate every November is that Lehigh and Lafayette have faced each other more than any other 2 active NCAA institutions ever. So it's not the oldest. That would be Princeton and Yale, 1873, but it is the most frequent. And this is something that I always brings joy as I circulate this in November. It's not groundbreaking for the company. It's the end of November, and there's a lot of college football teams that are trying to make the college football playoff, and there's programming. So there's a lot going on, but this is an example of, somebody who is a fan of their school or a fan of their team and is serving fans by being a fan. If there wasn't a Lehigh alum, in the department, maybe this would go under the radar, so to speak. I'm sure some of the leaders on our college football team would be all over it. They're great. But again, having people who are fans of their teams and a little bit more locked in to their teams than other people might be is something that the department really relies on. So this one is always something I like sending to the college football team at the end of November. So to wrap it up, some of the rewards and challenges that come with the job. I think I take a lot of pride in the impact that researchers can have on whatever their assignment is, especially if you're on a show, whether it's a SportsCenter show, a studio show, or if you're working on an event. The impact on the analysts and the viewers can be severe. So if, sometimes we're following the Monday Night Football game, I know 4 to 5 million people will stay for the first 20 minutes of Scott's show, of the 12 million that watch the game or whatever it is. So if I have a graphic that I think could catch a lot of people's eyes, I know I'm impacting the viewer well. And also, if the analysts are looking for some sort of statistical perspective to back up a point, they'll reach out to me in the prep leading up to the show and say, hey, it looks to me like Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic just aren't spacing well together. Is that right? Is that wrong? And I get to sort of steer the analyst in whichever direction to help amplify his point. I mentioned the live broadcast travel. That's certainly really rewarding to me. Camaraderie that we build on the road when we're covering a specific event, like when it's just the Masters instead of all sports on the SportsCenter. Those are really fun. As for the challenges, I think the vulnerability that I face sort of referenced this earlier, but there's a chance that you will make a typo and the graphics producer won't catch it and it will air on national television, or there will be a mistake in a script and that won't get caught as well, and the anchor reads it how you wrote it, and it's a little embarrassing, obviously. I certainly have had a few instances over the 7 years where a mistake has gotten on TV, and it's hard. I think a lot of people can probably relate to not exactly feeling great about how they performed at work that day in whatever it was they were trying to accomplish. So for us, it's really important not to let one day affect the next. Know that there's, there will be plenty of opportunity to make up for it, or to just have other good shifts. And then last thing I wanted to touch on that I think is true for a lot of the sports media industry, it can be a challenge to prioritize the story and overcome bias. So if my favorite team or player does really bad that night and the show wants some sort of research context surrounding it, it's important for me to set aside my fandom for that team and treat the story properly with the proper context, as opposed to sort of trying to paint them in a better light than they deserve, so to speak. Again, bias can be good sometimes, as you saw with the Lehigh Lafayette example. That probably doesn't make an ESPN platform without the bias. But if it's somebody, a team or a player I'm not very fond of, and they have a great performance, it's you need to prioritize the viewer and the story and what the viewer deserves, instead of potentially what your own interests are. So that's sort of what I have for the presentation portion of this. I'm super interested in any questions that people might have, because I know it was a lot to cover here in a short period of time. So Bryce, I will turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And thanks for giving us that insight into the work that you do. It was something that I've always thought about, being a sports fan and watching these major networks and major productions, and thinking about, like, how does the host know this obscure statistic or this obscure number, this obscure fact about whatever team it might end up being, when there's how many hundreds of players across a given sports organization, and knowing that they've got folks like you in their ear to be able to bounce those off of and make sure that information is correct for them. So a couple of questions that I had. And one that I think you and I had spoken about previously was, how do you guys, like, around like the lunch table, right? You and the other analysts, you're prepping for a show that night. During the pitch process to the producers, do you guys all show up with, these are the graphics that we made, and these are the stories that we want to talk about, and do you guys have to kind of like propose and pitch your ideas to them, and then they select, we like that, we don't like that? Like, how does that dynamic work?
Yeah, it's similar to that. We'll take today, for example. So the show follows the late ESPN NBA game tonight, which is Pelicans at Trailblazers. Actually, CJ McCollum going back to Portland tonight. That could be pretty interesting. So, granted that the show is following NBA programming, it'll be an NBA heavy show. So when the show meeting starts at 4:30, the producer, the researcher, the talent, and the director, and a few of their sort of segment producers, we're all in the room, and at 4:30, and we all come with rough ideas of what we want the show to look like. So tonight, one of the biggest stories is Kevin Durant is making his debut with the Suns. So we know, okay, there's going to be, obviously that might be the lead highlight, and then there will be some sort of research context. For me, since he hasn't played with them yet, like, I don't know, I won't come to that meeting with, hey, here's what I think we should do on Kevin Durant. But in other examples, it is like that. And so that's where I'll sort of speak up and say, hey, here's, like you mentioned, here are 4 graphics that I think we should strongly consider for the show tonight. And the producer might like them all. He might, or she might like half of them. And then maybe it's the host who likes one more than the other. But that is sort of how it goes. And then as the night materializes, because again, we're having that at 4:30, 5 o'clock, the show can look totally different at 9:30, 10. As the show materializes, new ideas come to mind, and I'll start pitching things sort of on the fly. And it's sort of the group looks at each other and they're like, yeah, this is actually really interesting. Let's do it.
Awesome. Looks like we've got a couple of questions that folks have been sending into the chat. So thank you all. Please feel free to continue to send those in. We'll dive into a couple of them. So first, Peter Mercury has had a couple of questions regarding NFL player safety. And so obviously that was a huge topic this last NFL season. How is that something that is being followed from an analyst perspective? What does that look like? And then he included a quote from Dr. Alan Sills, who's the chief medical officer for the NFL. Quote, "The NFL has been a leader on safety and has made real strides to try and better protect its players and make our games safer." So with the impacts of CTE, how do the analysts look at that new information, and then obviously players coming out with their stories about brain injuries and things like that? What is that like for you guys on the statistics and information?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I would say it's one of those sort of touchy subjects where it's not a traditional statistic for my department to drive context about. We don't really have injury and concussion data that the league itself has. And because it's sort of a touchy subject, we would probably not generate notes surrounding, hey, this was this guy's 9th concussion, most in the league since 2010. Like that would be in bad taste. Right. So, but it's a good question, because there are other sort of stay aways from, like, we wouldn't sort of do the same thing with suspensions. So unfortunately, I don't have a ton of light to shed into that besides, that's sort of how we react in those moments. It is more of the analyst's lane to talk about, hey, they're calling the game so much differently, or, in my day, like, we were allowed to hit and it was way better. It's more of an analyst thing. that's one of the few sort of areas where research generally doesn't really add a ton, as as you might sort of understand.
Sure. So thinking about like how the game evolves, right? The type of contact that you might see in like, the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s, those type of plays don't get made in the modern game. So I think maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but from an analyst perspective, like you're looking at more of like the hard numbers of like penalties per game, things that maybe be called of like what would quantify as a penalty. And maybe that's a better question for somebody that works on the analyst team for the NFL rather than for ESPN.
Well, for sure. I mean, we can, and yes, and my group can, we will say, look, unsportsmanlike conduct penalties are up X%, or roughing the passer penalties are up X%. But and then the analyst can say, use that as a way to say the game is safer or not safer.
All right. Awesome. Jim Mulholland asks, it seems that on-air personalities on SportsCenter or GetUp are thanking or naming their statistics person when it comes out with numbers. Hembo is a part of GetUp, for example, and it has become a bit of a personality. Does that progression interest you in your career in becoming a quote named on-air personality?
It can at some point. I know Paul Hembakidis, that's his name. He goes by Hembo. We know each other pretty well. He started out as the Mike and Mike researcher and then became part of GetUp. And when he left Mike and Mike, I actually, as you might have caught from a previous slide, I was on Golic and Wingo, and I ended up having my own segment once or twice a week where I would sort of read off a stat to Trey and Mike Golic, and they would decide whether they would tweet it or delete it on their social media accounts. So if it was a stat that they thought was really great, they would vote tweet it. And I thought it was definitely fun, but I sort of realized I didn't want to be in front of the camera 3 to 4 hours a day. It was a little stressful, but it was fun.
Awesome. Mark Shiner wants to know what is going to happen with most of the NCAA football broadcast rights going to Fox, CBS, and NBC next year, especially regarding having the statistics information on the ESPN app. So I think this is a really interesting question. So with the different broadcasting networks, all who also independently have their own kind of sports reporting outlets, what is the relationship like, if at all, if any, between the different networks? Or is it you have your own analysts and statisticians watching the game and making updates live? Or how does that work with the different broadcasting rights and sharing information amongst the networks?
Yeah, it is a good question. I will say it doesn't matter from our department's perspective what network is carrying a game. Regardless, the mission statement, and for the company really, is to serve sports fans. So if there's a game on CBS, it's the SEC championship, it doesn't matter. The statistics will still be available on all of ESPN's platforms. The shows will still cover it regardless. I'm sure there will be impact, to the college football playoff, etc. I will say what the programming that ESPN does buy will definitely be the priority. So, for instance, the SEC is actually moving from CBS to ESPN next year in 2024, and that's a huge deal for the company. And so you might see some more SEC content, but from the app and the website are concerned, the coverage will stay the same regardless of the network.
Gotcha. All right. Some other questions. We still got about 10 minutes or so, guys, so feel free to keep sending those questions in. We can definitely dig into them. So we've had a couple of questions regarding programs that you use to look up stats, aggregate data, look at trends. How do you actually get into the nitty-gritty aspects of the data? Is it that ESPN has a database of historical information, or are there other resources that you and your colleagues use to dig into, some of that information?
Another good question, and I see Benjamin references the Lehigh Sports Bureau, so I'll talk about that as well. So when I have an idea of something I want to look into, like the Eagles graphic, for example, it's a mix between third-party resources that the company pays a decent amount of money to help us find things, websites and programs that require logins, so that house data for us. And then the department has also spent or invested a lot of time into creating databases that are unique to ESPN. So there might be 200 hours spent on an NFL database over the off season to strengthen our resources. And so it's up to the researcher to know, okay, is this something that I'm using through one of the third-party websites, or is this something that's available in the database? And then, we have training on how to manipulate the database to run certain programs to get us the answer, use pivot tables and so on and so forth. And then we also do have a contract with the Lehigh Sports Bureau to answer questions for us if neither our databases or our other third-party providers can answer those questions. And they'll, a lot of times I'll look into something and I won't feel 1,000% sure it's accurate. I'm really close, but like it took me a while. So then I can ask a member of the Lehigh Sports Bureau for confirmation, and then so on and so forth. But it's a good question, and it's a good mix of third party versus in-house. And we're the department's always trying to strengthen the resources we have on our own in the off season, and it's a very lengthy list of databases that we have here.
Yeah, I can imagine across all of the sports that there are in the world. Obviously the big ones: football, baseball, basketball, things like that. But you've also got poker and tennis and cricket and other sports that maybe are not necessarily as popular in the United States, but equally as popular in other areas internationally. We've had a couple of questions about your schedule and your role. Obviously, with information and statistics needing to come out on people should be able to pull up, or can generally pull up, statistics at any point that they want. So what is your week and your schedule typically look like in managing your role? Is it 5 days, 40 hours a week? You mentioned working nights, and I know that you and I have talked about this briefly about not necessarily following a 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. schedule. So like, what does a typical day look like for you in your role?
Yeah, typically with a 4:30 show meeting and roughly a 1 o'clock off time for the show, I'll sort of sleep around 3 a.m. to 11 a.m. roughly. And then fast forward a few hours, when it gets to about 90 minutes or so before the show meeting, is when I'll sort of dig into that day's events and try to make sure I'm prepared for the meeting from a storylines and statistics perspective. It is 5 days a week. If I have an off day and don't have plans, I might find myself opening up my laptop while I'm watching games and just doing research for fun, because it is fun for me to do and it's my passion. So, but it is five days assigned, and a lot of times I'll sort of be doing research on my own without actually sort of realizing that that's what I'm doing, just because it's sort of fun for me to do while games are going on.
Awesome. Brett wanted to know, as a student who maybe is interested in pursuing sports media and sports journalism, is there anything that you would suggest as far as coursework, colleges, programs, opportunities that you would recommend, or any advice that maybe you would give to somebody who's aspiring to pursue a position similar to yours?
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing is to honestly say yes to as many things as you possibly can. Any role in the sports industry is going to benefit you in whatever way you may or may not see coming. I don't have sort of a list of courses or programs to recommend, but I would say get on some of these sports job websites. I know Teamwork Online is a really good one, and there's one specific to just colleges and universities. But if you are selling tickets for a AAA team, it might not be what you want to do in 5 years, but you will pick up something from that job that's going to help you land a different one or something that you'll take with you. So I would say have a very wide original scope as you look to break into this industry, because you will, any way in the door is a way in.
Awesome. So we're getting close on time. One question that I definitely wanted to touch on before we get closed out is, what type of story do you like working on better? The breaking news story or the record breaking story, and kind of the differences between those?
I love that question. But it's a clear answer for me personally. I definitely prefer working on the record-breaking story, mainly because of the time that it allows to prepare for it. So when Aaron Judge is coming up on the American League record, and it's a couple, months or weeks where I can prepare and try to come up with as many outside the box ideas to help differentiate ESPN's content from all of the other sports networks, who obviously are aware of this record-breaking accomplishment. But like for LeBron James, if there's, the more time you have, the more you can try to differentiate your content. When it comes to breaking news, like when the Kevin Durant trade happened 2 weeks ago, and we were on the air at about 1:30. That's a very stressful time in the control room, where everybody's trying to, change what we're doing within 60 seconds. Graphics need to be built. Some sort of context needs to be ready. That's definitely a little more stressful, but also gets the adrenaline going a little bit more. I just prefer the flexibility a little bit more for the record-breaking stuff.
Absolutely. And I think maybe a last question to kind of touch on, I think this would be a good kind of closing statement for us, from Scott Blair. Was there anything that surprised you about your position or working in the industry?
I'm not totally sure if I'm sure a lot of it surprised me. I had no experience working in live television, so a lot of this was sort of new to me when I started, and I guess I would be surprised to the extent of what is required to put television on the air. It seems really simple when you are just viewing it in your living room or your couch, but as as a researcher, when you're interacting with 7 to 8 people, and then they're interacting with 7 or 8 people, all of a sudden it's 30 people that are making the show happen in one way or the other. That was surprising to me. And then also the extent to which people rely on researchers was a little surprising. It's obvious that information is important, especially at ESPN, but a lot of our anchors don't like to do their research and rely on us really heavily. So that was sort of a fun surprise, was how much they need us.
Awesome. And with that, we are right about at time. So wanted to take a moment to thank David for his time in allowing us and ESPN as an organization to release him to let us talk to us and learn a little bit more about the work that he does and in his role there. I definitely have a greater appreciation for the work that you do and understanding that behind the scenes. And thank you to all of our attendees who joined us this afternoon. If there is any additional questions or anybody would like to reach out regarding today's Mountain Talk or future Mountain Talks, then please feel free to reach out to me. There will also be a follow-up survey that will be emailed to all of the attendees within the next day or so. Please send us your feedback on the topic and how we can improve these talks for you moving forward. So thank you, David. Thank you, our participants, and everyone. Please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Bryce. Appreciate it.